Greetings, Dumelang, Sanbonani. Welcome to the third episode of the Politics of You and Me. You are joined today by your host, Mpho Nyamathe, changemaker, intersectional activist, here to bring you bold conversations, real solutions as per the standards. Welcome to the new episode of my podcast. It's going to be such an engaging episode. It's centered around Human Rights Day, and we are going to be talking about what it means to observe Human Rights Day and to interact with Human Rights Day as a South African. And with that, I also just want to take a moment to introduce the podcast to anyone who's new and joining us for the first time. Welcome to the Politics of You and Me. This is a space where I really share with my listeners how politics is ingrained in every aspect of our lives, from the digital divide to gender-based violence, from environmental injustice to the educational crisis. Every issue shapes the way we live, work, and choose to exist. And this podcast unpacks the lived realities of South Africans, amplifying voices often left unheard. This is a hub to engage and challenge while learning about current affairs in South Africa and beyond. This platform is guided by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as per Agenda 2030. As such, this is a platform to generate impact through dialogue. In the last two episodes, I've been hinting towards this, talking about, that this podcast is really guided and is a means of implementation to some degree of the Sustainable Development Goals and bringing them to our local voices and to our local audiences as well here in South Africa, but also beyond. But before we dig into a recap of last week's episode, as well as a further discussion, I want to really invite you all to have this discussion with me, and we're going to start with something simple, with what are the Sustainable Development Goals, right? It's very telling within the name. It's basically a means to ensure that even as we advance and we progress as society, we do it in a way that ensures that no one is left behind. We do it in a way that is sustainable, meaning longevity, meaning the solutions for today are the solutions that we can carry into tomorrow, right? And the Sustainable Development Goals are basically like a plan of action for people, planet, prosperity. It is a platform that acknowledges that poverty and inequality, these are the greatest global challenges, and it's really important for us to address these as young leaders, as community members, as people in civil society organizations, but also as government officials, right? And basically the Sustainable Development Goals, specifically under Agenda 2030, really works towards, countries, stakeholders working together in collaborative partnership, and to just ensure that everyone has access to a good life, a prosperous life with plenty of opportunities, right? And with that, there are 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and with that, they also have 169 targets, right? And basically, under Agenda 2030, there's just, a call for the universal respect of human rights, human dignity, the rule of law, justice, equality, and non-discrimination, right? Agenda 2030 also acknowledges the growing rate of climate change and how we need to start thinking of strategies of adaptation, of mitigation, of climate financing, right? In a way that, protects those who are most vulnerable, in a way that protects and, promotes the protection and the biodiversity of all living things that are dying around us due to climate change, right? And with Agenda 30, it also, acknowledges and also seeks to ensure sustainable, inclusive economic growth as well as decent work for all. It acknowledges the problem of, or rather the high rates of unemployment among youth especially, right? So just wanted to, really give a well-rounded explanation as to that, So going on to the next part of this episode, we're going to just be doing a quick little recap on the previous episode. Our second episode was the practice of environmental injustice in South Africa's mines. During this episode, I focused on two key resources that really directed my thinking and my approach to giving you my perspective. And hopefully in due time, these are also perspectives that will be challenged and engaged with experts and speakers in the field as well, right? But for now, you just have me, and I'm going to be digging into Jacqueline Koch and just giving a summary of what this author, presented about the inequalities in coal mining industries, right? So this is a journal article that is published under the Taylor and Francis Group in the Development Southern Africa Journal of 2019, and it's titled Resistance to Coal Inequalities and the Possibilities of a Just Transition in South Africa, right? And what I really, really enjoyed from last week's discussion, but also from this journal article, is just how, we got a really, really good background on coal as a crucial part of South Africa's energy mix, how it's generated jobs in the past, and so on and so forth, right? And even though there has been some economic benefits, as well as just some sort of centralization of coal as our mineral energy complex, it is also important to acknowledge the very painful lived realities of people living in mining affected communities, your Witbank, your Highveld regions, right? Because the people in these regions experience severe health impacts, right? Where so many people in the Mpumalanga region experience so many cases of chronic bronchitis, thousands among young children aged 6 to 12, but also a couple of cases as well in adults as well, right? And with that, we also see, the impact of the mines on the quality of air, and how that affects the environment as a whole, right? Because when we're looking at the quality of air in mining affected areas, we see that it actually also impacts the soil and affects the residents' ability to grow crops and make use of food gardens, which is something that can be considered so essential in the face of price inflation, in the face of poverty, and all of that, right? And some other social inequalities related to land displacement, right? The decisions of building a coal mine without consulting a community, right? And the burden that also falls on the women in those regions who now act as caretakers for people who fall ill, or even women who have to work harder to obtain, who have to work harder to make use of soil that's, on the verge of being infertile or is already infertile, right? And with that, we also opened up, a conversation about the privatization of renewable energies, right? And it is important to acknowledge that, yes, coal does have detrimental impact on our environment. This is something that is well researched, and also something that was like a key discussion point in the cancel coal case led by the African Climate Alliance, Groundworks, Vugani movement, and they were represented by the Center of Environmental Rights, right? This is something that is, super important, when looking at the right to a safe environment that promotes, our well-being. But, even in the face of that, as we transition, we also just need to make sure that we account for people who belonged to, or rather who occupied the coal mining industry and who worked there, right? I can't stop thinking about, the case in which 2,300 workers, they basically lost their jobs after the closure, or rather the partial closure of Hadrina. And those workers, they were left unaccounted for. They were hired by labor brokers. They were not accounted for by Eskom. And those were many families that lost breadwinners. And that's something we also need to really, really consider in our conversation, right? And, even just looking at our previous cases that are centered around environmental injustice, that are centered around mining, right? When we look at, for example, the Thabameti Power Company, they were actually granted authorization by the Chief Director of Environmental Affairs to build a power station in Lapalele, a water-scarce area, right? And a prerequisite for even, doing this was having conducted a climate change impact assessment. And ultimately what this climate change impact assessment would do is it would mitigate the steps that polluting parties would take. And it would also just show the projected environmental damage that the power station would do in that region, especially it being a water scarce region. And there was some resistance to actually conduct this assessment, right? But it was only after this assessment was conducted, they saw how much of an impact, a negative impact it had on the environment. And with that came the ruling that, any development that happens should consider community impacts, specifically within the context of climate change, right? This was the Earth Life Africa Johannesburg versus Minister of Environmental Affairs case. And it's just really important, to observe all of this and to really, really make sense of where we're at in terms of ensuring justice for people who live in underserved, overlooked, mining-affected communities, right? And specifically when we're looking at the Marikana massacre and how a labor dispute was literally treated as a criminal issue, where 34 people were gunned down. And even on that day, the community in the Northwest, they lost so many breadwinners. And, during my time as a sociology major at the University of Johannesburg, that's one of my majors. I also majored in politics, international relations. But during my time as a sociologist, although at heart I still believe I am, I was able to interact with the widows of Marikana and really experience through their eyes, what their day-to-day looks like, and the stories that they will tell you are heartbreaking. They'll tell you that, in the Marikana region, when you call the police, no one shows up. They'll tell you that basic service delivery is something that's, not always frequent. They'll also tell you of the safety issues that happens in the region, and that time they don't also, feel like they can actively count on the police as well, And it's just really, really important, especially in the face of Human Rights Day, and we're getting to the subject at hand, for us to look at, the communities that experience severe oppression in apartheid in a time of, severe oppression, to look at those communities back then and to look at them now and really, really determine whether or not we have really, truly fulfilled our obligation to make sure that people who have constantly been left behind are being uplifted, right? And I implore us to just, consider, these kinds of conversations, especially for just, tracking progress and really, monitoring if we are as if we are being as impactful, as progressive, as we'd like to be as South Africans, as policymakers. Who are we constantly leaving behind? Where are there policy gaps, and where can we make an impact? Those are the questions I need us to ask ourselves, especially in lieu of ensuring that everyone has access to the rights that they are so entitled to, right? So with that, I want us to step into the next part of this podcast, which is going to be this week's episode, and that is observing Human Rights Day in South Africa. And we, this weekend, have been celebrating Human Rights Day. Many of the people listening here based in South Africa have probably enjoyed a long weekend where they didn't have to go to work on Friday. And with that, I also, in the spirit of how we take things in this platform, I want us to engage with, how Human Rights Day came about. So let's go back to the history for a bit. When we're looking at Human Rights Day, this really came about on the 21st of March in 1960. So let's go back to, the history of this day. And when we're looking at how Human Rights Day came about, it is important to note the 21st of March 1960. This is where thousands of South Africans marched to the Sharpeville police station. They gathered peacefully, right, to protest the carrying of passbooks. And the problem with these books is they were ultimately passes that worked to restrict Black South Africans as to their movements, where they work, where they live, how they travel, how they exist, right? And the day of the 21st of March 1960 was a resistance to that, a peaceful resistance, but it was met with so much violence. So many police officers started to appear, and eventually it just evolved into a situation where 69 people were killed, more than 180 people were injured, and there were about 700 bullets that had been fired, all by the police as well, And that's how you really, see the violence at the time, and as well as the distaste for Black people, marginalized bodies, claiming their rights as they should, right? And when we, look at our painful past, right, and the tragedies of that day, how many lives were lost, breadwinners, daughters, sons, siblings. And when we, match that in conjunction to where Sharpeville is today, it's really important to note that, we're experiencing a lot of the issues that underserved communities who experience historical oppression are also experiencing, right? For example, people in Sharpeville will often say that they feel overlooked by the government, and that the Human Rights Day is the only time they see service delivery, a glimpse of service delivery, at the local government level, right? And, they'll even tell you that there's no service delivery for, the next year until the following Human Rights Day. And, with some people even saying that the money spent on the event would be better spent on improving the township. It just shows us how much more work we need to do. Even though we have traveled about 30 years or more than 30 years from the apartheid era, it is really telling that we still have so much work to do as young people, community leaders, members of government, people living in this country. There's still so much work to do in terms of speaking on the experiences of marginalized groups, and also giving a platform for people living in these communities to actively voice their concerns and to have those concerns like actually addressed by government, whether it's really cracking down on service delivery and making sure that no one is ever left behind, because it is a shame to see systemic inequalities that come from our past still be reenacted even today. And I probably said this in the previous episode, but I really, really think it is important now more than ever to lean into, what Cyril Ramaphosa said in his State of the Nation address, particularly the point where he spoke about apartheid town planning and how that needs to be mitigated. And that is so true, because a lot of the social inequalities we experience, a lot of the spatial divides that we experience in our society are really linked to the fact that we still have spatial divides that mimic our historic past, our painful past. And it is important to actively confront those, because as we advance and as we, move up in terms of development, in terms of our priorities as South Africans, we are leaving people behind, people who were never meant to be left behind, people who really should have always been at the center of these kinds of conversations, of these kinds of decisions, because already they experienced having to break through such, a thick layer of red tape, and in the spirit of it being Human Rights Day, it is important for us to really have a conversation about truly reconciliating, those inequalities and those gaps. And with that, I want to also, touch on how, people in Sharpeville also, complain about uncollected rubbish that piles up on street corners, and how there's a lack of service delivery in terms of waste management. They really have open raw sewage in their communities and roads that are really full of potholes and not in great quality, and it's Sharpeville as a municipality as well. It falls under the Mpho local municipality. It is deemed one of the poorest performing municipalities in Gauteng and has been placed under administration several times, right? And it's actually, really painful to think about it, because, Sharpeville it's a place that's thick with history, to a point where, every year during this time, they'll have politicians coming into that area to observe Human Rights Day. Yet, even though it's a place that's filled with history, and it's a place where constitutional rights were recognized, how is it that in post-apartheid South Africa, in contemporary South Africa, that this is also the same place where a lot of constitutional rights related to housing, access to water, environmental justice are just simply not there? And this is what we see from the residents. This is what we see from people living in those communities. And it's really time for us to uplift places that never had an even playing ground, if I can say so. And with that, it's also important to, acknowledge, some of the problems they experience within those communities, like unemployment, right? And crime. Many of the community members saying that, a lot of these, they go hand in hand. When unemployment levels go up, so does crime, and even safety, the question of safety. There's so many safety concerns, especially walking after dark. And I share the same reflections I've gotten the same kind of feedback from the widows of Marikana, and they'll tell you that specifically on the day where I met with them with a portion of my sociology class. When the workshop was running late, they'd communicate to say that where they live is not a safe area and that they can't afford to get there dark, And I really think that, yes, so much has been done in terms of human rights, but yes, so much more still has to be done, because there are people who are struggling with basics: water, electricity, housing. With more than 30 years into our democracy, that can't be it, and I need us to really, start tapping into that, and really start, talking to our government leaders, to the people around us, to civil society organizations, mobilize for impact, build awareness, and capacitate yourself with knowledge, do your research, interact with organizations that are centered around, peace building, human rights, and actively engaging government, right? It's so important now more than ever. There is a part of me that worries that with the kind of inequalities that we witness in, today's day and age, we just have to, pair that with systemic change. It can't be that every time, we celebrate how far we come from, the space between where we come from and where we're actually at is not actually that significant, And I need us to do it for, people who deserve to experience a life of peace, of prosperity. People in townships and underserved communities, they are so underserved and overlooked to the point where sometimes the electricity is something that they don't have access to 4 hours. At that point, it's not even load shedding, it's power outages, mashed with an array of service delivery issues, right? And another point that I'd just like to share, my last point on this note in terms of, Sharpeville and where it's at today versus where it was at in the past. There was actually an interview with a 72-year-old resident who was 7 years old at the time of the Sharpeville Massacre, right? And to this day, she's still living in a small shack. She doesn't have basic facilities. She's living in an informal settlement on an old cemetery, right? And with that, that's where we see that very little has changed for many of the South Africans living within these communities. It's definitely a different time and slightly wider freedoms. I mean, when I say slightly wider freedoms, I'm thinking, the freedom of movement without a pass or all of that. But when we're looking at things like, sustainable development, actually having access to basics, water, electricity, bathrooms, a roof over your head, that is genuinely, like a formal settlement instead of an informal settlement, right? A place that isn't vulnerable to rain, to extreme weather, right? It's really important to acknowledge that, and to also just realize that more needs to be done for people who have been suffering for years on end. There was a time where I even read this article on Daily Maverick where it was talking about this elderly woman who had applied for housing via the RDP program. And even though she had applied for years on end, I believe in 1994, she still didn't get an opportunity to have shelter. If anything, she lived in an informal settlement, and even her bed was washed away by the waters, not having access to a bathroom. And she eventually passed away without having that housing. Now, when we don't have conversations about systemic change, when we don't demand more from our government, when we don't demand more from our world leaders, that is the kind of reality that we're looking at. We're looking at a reality where things look like they're changing, but they only change for a certain type of people. And if you are living in an instance where you are still experiencing generational poverty, the change there is very minimal. And this is something that we need to stop taking with us as South Africans. We need to take forward progress and leave behind, any form of exclusion that keeps people behind. With that, I want to end off the session, or rather dive into the last part of this episode by digging into the Bill of Rights, which is in chapter 2 of South Africa's Constitution. Now, South Africa's Constitution of 1996 is the highest law of the land, and we've received applause internationally for having one of the strongest institutions in the world. And with that, I also just want to take a moment for us to just go through some of the sections within the Bill of Rights and looking at how they can be applicable or non-applicable to contemporary South Africa. With that, we're going to go into the closing. So let me dig into the final part of this episode. And when looking at chapter 2, the Bill of Rights, for example, I'm looking at section... I'm going to start with my favorite one, actually, if I may. I'm going to start with section 24, which is the right to an environment that is not harmful to their health or well-being, to have the environment protected for the benefit of past and future generations through reasonable legislative and other measures that prevent pollution, ecological degradation, promote conservation, and secure ecologically sustainable development and use of natural resources, while promoting justifiable economic and social development. And here I can't help but to think about all of the people in mining affected communities who have an environment that literally makes them sick. All I can think about is people who live in close proximity to waste dumps and landfills that affect their health, right? And when looking at section 27 on healthcare, food, water, and social security, it stipulates that everyone should have access to healthcare services, including reproductive healthcare, sufficient food and water, social security, and that the state must take reasonable legislative and other measures within its available resource to achieve progressive realization of each of these rights. And when looking at the state of our healthcare system, it's really important to acknowledge that the healthcare system, particularly in underserved communities, in township communities, is not up to, standard. A lot of the times women need genuine help and access to reproductive health care. And a lot of the times those needs are not met with a level of seriousness, especially when considering a lot of the illnesses that women experience that are related to reproductive health care. With that, it's also imperative to realize the lived struggles of people who are homeless at this time. They do not have access to food and water. They really are at the crux of food insecurity. Who's also experiencing food insecurity? Waste reclaimers. They do not experience enough credit, and they're not given enough credit for the work that they do. And a lot of the times they don't really receive too much money for recycling, all of these materials. And this also affects their ability to enrich their livelihoods, get food to their families. And this is a conversation that, we need to just consider having, to say that we have the world's greatest constitution. How is it that so many people are not benefiting from it, right? The same goes for housing. In accordance to Section 26 of the Bill of Rights, everyone has the right to adequate housing. Yet so many people are currently living in informal settlements, so many of which pose a risk to their well-being. And it's really, really important to account for these gaps and to really, really start creating solutions that actively improve the livelihoods of people in these situations. We can't wait anymore. We can't, keep postponing, procrastinating. We need action now, because even though we are observing Human Rights Day in South Africa this weekend, but particularly on Friday, there's so many people who don't really relate to the day, and the day doesn't really hold significance to them, and that is painful. And to change that, we need to actively, account and promote for systemic change in South Africa's society. So thank you so much for joining me for yet another episode where we have bold conversations and present real solutions. Honestly, my real solutions for this day and for this conversation that we're having, particularly on Human Rights Day, is that we don't need any new forms of legislation, any new forms of policies. We need to fix what's already there. We need to work with what we already have and uplift those who are constantly left behind, uplift those who need to be empowered, and uplift those who don't really feel what it is to have human rights, because their lives are not so different from what they used to be in the past. And I implore you all to join me once again next Sunday. This has been such a wonderful, conversation to have. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I hope more of you join me as we explore next week's topic. But until then, peace and love. I'm signing out. Thank you for joining me. Love and light.